Sarah Chun adjusted the coffee service cart as it rolled down the narrow aisle of Flight 447, the gentle hum of engines providing a steady backdrop to the murmur of passenger conversations. The first-class cabin held its usual mix of business travelers and military personnel heading to various assignments, their crisp uniforms a stark contrast to her Navy flight attendant blazer. The passenger in seat 14C raised his hand with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being served. Colonel Marcus Webb, according to his boarding pass, though his tone suggested he expected everyone to know that already. Coffee, black, no sugar, he said without looking up from his tablet, displaying classified briefing materials. Certainly, sir, Sarah replied, filling his cup with practiced precision. The hot liquid steamed in the recycled cabin air as she moved to set it on his tray table. Webb glanced up briefly, his eyes taking in her name tag and uniform with a dismissive assessment of someone evaluating hired help. Make sure you keep it coming. Long flight ahead, and some of us have real work to do. 2 rows behind him, Major Lisa Torres exchanged a knowing look with her seatmate, Captain Rick Dalton. Both wore the confident bearing of F-16 pilots fresh from advanced tactical training. Torres leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard. Must be nice, she said to Dalton, having nothing more challenging than serving coffee and peanuts. Meanwhile, we are heading into one of the most complex joint operations in recent history. Dalton nodded, adjusting his service ribbons with obvious pride. These civilian crews have no idea what real pressure looks like. Push a button, pour a drink, smile pretty. Not exactly rocket science. Sarah continued her service routine, her movements efficient and professional as she distributed beverages and snacks. Her training had taught her to maintain composure regardless of passenger attitudes, though the irony of their comments was not lost on her. She had logged more flight hours in high-stress situations than most of these officers would see in their entire careers. From across the aisle, a Navy commander leaned toward his companion. "Look at her," he said quietly, gesturing in Sarah's direction. "Probably never been higher than 30,000 feet, except as a passenger. No concept of what it means to actually pilot aircraft in combat conditions." His companion, a Marine lieutenant colonel, chuckled softly. "Different worlds entirely. She serves coffee, we serve our country. Not exactly comparable skill sets. Have you ever been on a military flight?" Sarah heard the question from a curious passenger in row 12 as she passed. The businessman seemed genuinely interested in making conversation, perhaps hoping to hear about exciting adventures from someone he assumed was purely civilian. Before you ask, this might be a good time to think about your own experiences with air travel. Whether you're watching from Texas or Maine or anywhere in between, have you ever wondered about the stories of the people serving you during flights? Sometimes the most extraordinary backgrounds hide behind the most ordinary appearances. Sarah smiled politely at the businessman's question. "Just commercial flights like this one, sir. Though I do find aviation fascinating from a technical perspective." "Technical perspective," Torres repeated under her breath to Dalton, barely suppressing a laugh. "Like understanding why the seatbelt light comes on." The morning service continued smoothly despite the undercurrent of condescension from the military passengers. Sarah had encountered this attitude countless times during her years of maintaining cover identities. People saw what they expected to see, and a woman in a flight attendant uniform pouring coffee fit neatly into their preconceptions about capability and training. Colonel Webb held up his empty cup again, this time with slightly more impatience. "Miss, when you get a chance. Some of us have mission briefs to review before we land." "Of course, sir," Sarah responded, refilling his cup immediately. As she did, she noticed the tactical planning documents spread across his tray table, recognizing the formation patterns and targeting coordinates from her own extensive mission experience. The irony of serving coffee while reviewing plans for operations she had likely flown similar missions for was almost overwhelming. The morning sun streamed through the small aircraft windows as Flight 447 continued its eastward journey, carrying its passengers toward destinations and assignments that would soon reveal just how wrong first impressions could be. As the flight settled into its cruising altitude, Sarah moved through the cabin collecting breakfast trays and refilling beverages. The military passengers had grown more comfortable, their conversations turning to shop talk about current operations and assignments. She maintained her professional demeanor while her trained ear automatically processed the tactical discussions happening around her. Major Torres pulled out a tablet displaying satellite reconnaissance images. The target coordinates look solid, she said to Captain Dalton, but the approach vector is going to be challenging. Weather systems are moving in faster than predicted. Dalton studied the imagery over her shoulder. Air superiority should not be an issue with our current assets in theater. The real challenge will be coordinating with ground units for extraction timing. Sarah paused near their row, ostensibly adjusting the overhead compartment, but actually observing the mission parameters displayed on Torres's screen. The coordinates were familiar, part of a region she had flown reconnaissance over multiple times during her last deployment. The tactical challenges they were discussing were ones she had personally navigated successfully. "Excuse me, miss," Colonel Webb called from his seat. "When you have a moment, could you adjust the air vent above my seat? The temperature control seems to be malfunctioning." Sarah moved to assist him, reaching up to adjust the airflow while noting the classified communications equipment he had spread across his workspace. She recognized the encryption protocols and frequency settings from her own experience with similar systems during joint operations. "Thank you," Webb said dismissively, already turning his attention back to his work. As she stepped away, she heard him speaking into a secure satellite phone. "Command, this is Webb, confirming arrival time for Operation Thunder Ridge briefing. Personnel manifest shows all primary flight crews accounted for." From the row behind Webb, a Navy commander was reviewing personnel files on his laptop. "These new pilots coming up through the program," he said to his seatmate, "they think they know everything after basic flight training. Reality is going to hit them hard when they face real combat conditions." His companion, a senior master sergeant, nodded in agreement. "Most of them have never experienced actual enemy contact. Flying training missions is completely different from having surface-to-air missiles tracking your aircraft." Sarah continued her service duties, but her mind was already calculating the defensive maneuvers required for the type of mission they were describing. She had successfully evaded more missile locks than these officers had probably encountered in their combined careers, but her cover required maintaining the appearance of someone whose biggest challenge was managing beverage service. The aircraft hit a patch of minor turbulence, causing some passengers to grip their armrests nervously. Sarah noticed immediately and moved smoothly through the cabin, checking on passenger comfort with a natural balance that came from years of flying in much more challenging conditions. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," the announcement came over the intercom. "We are experiencing some light chop due to weather systems ahead. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions." Torres looked up from her mission planning materials with mild concern. "Hope this does not delay our arrival," she said to Dalton. "The briefing schedule is already tight, and any weather delays could impact the entire operation timeline." Dalton checked his watch and shook his head. "Civilian pilots always play it safe with weather. Military crews push through conditions like this without hesitation. Different risk tolerance entirely." Sarah refilled their coffee cups, noting the dismissive way they spoke about civilian aviation capabilities. If they only knew that she had successfully landed aircraft in conditions that would ground most military flights, their perspectives might be different. But maintaining cover meant accepting their assumptions about her limitations. The turbulence continued intermittently as the aircraft pushed through the weather system. Sarah moved through the cabin with practiced ease. Her movements adapted automatically to the aircraft's motion in ways that suggested extensive flight experience to anyone paying close attention. However, the military passengers were too focused on their own preparations to notice the subtle indicators of her advanced training. Colonel Webb finished his secure communication and turned to the officer beside him. "The mission profile looks straightforward on paper, but intelligence reports suggest enemy capabilities may be more advanced than initially assessed. Air defense systems have been upgraded significantly. Sarah passed their row again, this time collecting empty cups and napkins. She had read similar intelligence reports during her own mission briefings, and her experience suggested that the enemy capabilities were indeed more sophisticated than standard assessments indicated. The tactical approaches these officers were planning would likely encounter challenges they were not fully prepared for. The morning service period was drawing to a close as passengers settled in for the remainder of the flight. Sarah began preparing the cabin for the next phase of service while mentally cataloging the operational details she had overheard. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. Serving refreshments to officers discussing missions, she was more qualified to fly than many of them were to plan. 3 hours into the flight, the aircraft encountered more severe weather than anticipated. What had started as light turbulence was intensifying into something that required the crew's immediate attention. Sarah secured loose items in the galley as the plane bucked against increasingly hostile air currents. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time with a more serious tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are deviating from our planned route due to an unexpected severe weather system. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for potential rough air." Sarah moved quickly through first class, ensuring tray tables were secured and carry-on items properly stowed. The military passengers looked up from their work with varying degrees of concern as the aircraft continued to shake more violently than before. "How severe are we talking here?" Major Torres asked her seatmate as another strong jolt rocked the plane. "This feels more intense than standard weather turbulence." Captain Dalton gripped his armrest as the aircraft dropped suddenly before recovering. Civilian pilots tend to overcorrect for weather conditions. Probably nothing more than precautionary measures. From the cockpit area, Sarah could hear increased radio chatter between the pilots and air traffic control. The tone was becoming more urgent, though the passengers could not make out the specific details of the communications. She recognized the stress indicators in the crew's voices from her own experience in high-pressure flight situations. Colonel Webb looked up from his secure communications equipment as another severe jolt interrupted his work. "Miss," he called to Sarah, "do you know how long these weather delays typically last? Some of us have time-sensitive arrivals to make." "The pilots are working with air traffic control to find the best route through the storm system," Sarah replied professionally. "They will update us as soon as they have more information." The aircraft shuddered again, this time more violently than before. Several passengers gasped as their belongings shifted despite being secured. The overhead compartments creaked under the stress of the turbulent conditions, and the cabin lights flickered momentarily. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, "we are experiencing more severe weather than initially forecasted. We may need to divert to an alternate airport if conditions do not improve. Flight attendants, please take your seats immediately." Sarah quickly made her way to the crew station, but not before noticing the increasing concern on the faces of even the most experienced military passengers. The Navy commander who had earlier dismissed civilian flight capabilities now looked genuinely worried as the aircraft pitched and rolled through the storm system. The radio communications from the cockpit became more frequent and intense. Sarah could hear fragments of conversations with air traffic control about alternate landing sites and emergency protocols. Her training allowed her to understand that the situation was becoming more serious than routine weather avoidance. Air traffic control was reporting system-wide delays and diversions as multiple aircraft encountered the same unexpected weather pattern. The storm had intensified rapidly, catching meteorologists and flight planners off guard. What should have been a routine flight was becoming a test of both crew skill and aircraft capabilities. Another violent shake ran through the aircraft, followed by a brief loss of altitude that left several passengers gripping their armrests with white knuckles. The confident discussions about military operations had ceased entirely as everyone focused on the immediate reality of their deteriorating flight conditions. The cabin crew exchanged concerned glances as they secured themselves in their stations. The head flight attendant was in constant communication with the cockpit, receiving updates about the severity of the weather system and potential alternate landing sites. The situation was evolving rapidly beyond normal operational parameters. Through the small cabin windows, passengers could see dark clouds and lightning flashes that illuminated the churning weather system surrounding the aircraft. The storm appeared to extend in all directions, creating a challenge that would test even experienced pilots under the best circumstances. Colonel Webb attempted to continue his secure communications, but found the satellite connection unstable due to the weather interference. His mission coordination calls were being interrupted by static and signal loss, adding to his growing frustration with the developing situation. The aircraft's engines strained against the turbulent air currents as the pilots worked to maintain course and altitude through the increasingly hostile weather system. Each decision point required careful consideration of safety factors that were rapidly changing as the storm intensified around them. The severity of the weather situation prompted the military passengers to shift into crisis management mode. Colonel Webb unbuckled his seatbelt despite the captain's instructions and moved toward the front of the cabin where he could better assess the situation developing around them. "Captain," Webb called toward the cockpit area, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command decisions. "What is our current status and available options for emergency landing sites?" Major Torres stood up from her seat, her pilot training taking over as she evaluated the aircraft's behavior through the turbulence. "The flight characteristics suggest we are dealing with severe wind shear and possible downdrafts. Standard civilian approach protocols may not be sufficient for these conditions." Captain Dalton joined her in the aisle, both pilots now focused on the technical challenges facing the aircraft. "These commercial crews are trained for routine operations," he said quietly to Torres. "Emergency weather flying requires a different skill set entirely." Sarah continued monitoring the situation from her crew station, observing how quickly the military passengers had transitioned from dismissive confidence to active concern. Their earlier comments about civilian capabilities seemed forgotten as they faced the reality of a potentially dangerous flight situation. The head flight attendant emerged from the cockpit after consulting with the pilots. She addressed the military officers who had gathered near the front of the cabin. "The pilots are evaluating multiple alternate airports, but the storm system is larger than initially reported. Most nearby fields are experiencing similar conditions." Webb frowned as he processed this information. "What about military airfields in the region? They typically have better approach capabilities for adverse weather conditions." Torres nodded in agreement. "Military installations have precision approach radar and better ground control systems. Commercial airports might not have the equipment needed for this type of emergency landing." The aircraft shuddered through another series of violent jolts that tested everyone's resolve. Several passengers looked genuinely frightened now as the reality of their situation became apparent. The comfortable assumptions about routine air travel were being challenged by circumstances beyond normal parameters. Sarah watched the military officers attempt to take charge of a situation they did not fully understand. Their confidence in their own capabilities was evident, but their lack of familiarity with commercial aviation procedures was equally apparent. They were applying military solutions to civilian aviation challenges. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced over the intercom, "we are currently coordinating with air traffic control to identify the best available landing option. The weather system is affecting multiple airports in our region, but we are confident we will find a suitable alternate destination." Colonel Webb turned to his fellow officers. "We need to establish communication with military command and coordinate potential emergency response if this situation deteriorates further. Our mission schedules will need to be adjusted accordingly." The Navy commander who had earlier dismissed civilian flight crews now looked uncomfortable as the aircraft continued to battle the storm system. "This is beyond anything I have experienced in routine military transport flights," he admitted to his seatmate. Captain Dalton moved closer to the cockpit area, trying to overhear the radio communications between the pilots and air traffic control. His expression grew more serious as he caught fragments of conversations about deteriorating conditions at multiple airports. The storm appears to be intensifying rather than moving through the area as predicted, Torres observed, studying the lightning flashes visible through the cabin windows. Weather forecasting can be unreliable for rapidly developing systems like this. Sarah remained at her station, but found herself mentally calculating alternative approach procedures and emergency landing techniques that these officers were not considering. Her extensive experience with adverse weather flying provided perspectives that could be valuable, but her cover identity prevented her from offering input. The secure communications equipment that Colonel Webb had been using earlier was now completely non-functional due to weather interference. His attempts to contact military command were met with static and signal loss, adding to the isolation they were experiencing. The aircraft's autopilot disengaged briefly as the pilots took manual control to navigate through a particularly severe section of the storm. The sudden change in flight characteristics was noticeable to the military passengers, whose own flight experience told them this indicated a significant challenge. Webb approached the head flight attendant again. "Is there any way we can establish direct communication with air traffic control or approach the cockpit to offer assistance? Several of us have extensive flight experience that might be helpful." The flight attendant looked uncertain about protocol, but promised to relay the offer to the pilots. The military passengers began discussing contingency plans among themselves. Their earlier confidence in civilian aviation capabilities now replaced by genuine concern about the developing emergency situation. The weather situation continued to deteriorate as the aircraft fought through increasingly violent turbulence. What had been concerning was now becoming genuinely dangerous, with the pilots struggling to maintain stable flight through conditions that exceeded normal operational parameters. From the cockpit came urgent radio transmissions that fragments of which could be overheard by passengers near the front of the cabin. The pilots were reporting severe downdrafts and requesting priority handling from air traffic control for emergency landing clearance. Major Torres studied the aircraft's behavior through the storm with growing concern. "The flight characteristics are becoming increasingly unstable," she said to Captain Dalton. "These conditions are pushing the aircraft beyond its designed operational envelope." Colonel Webb had positioned himself where he could monitor both the cockpit communications and the passenger cabin. His military command experience told him that decisive action would soon be required, but the limitations of civilian aviation protocols were frustrating his attempts to assist. The head flight attendant returned from another consultation with the pilots, her professional composure showing signs of strain. "The pilots are reporting that most alternate airports in the region are now below landing minimums due to the storm system. We are extending our search radius for suitable landing sites." As Sarah moved through the cabin, checking on passenger safety, she overheard fragments of the radio communications between the aircraft and air traffic control. Her trained ear caught details that the military passengers were missing, including references to wind shear conditions and approach difficulties that she had personally navigated during her combat flying experience. While securing loose items in the galley, Sarah heard Colonel Webb discussing tactical communication protocols with the other officers. They were attempting to establish emergency contact procedures using their military communication equipment, but the weather interference continued to block their signals. "Sir," Sarah said quietly as she passed Webb's seat, approaching him with the professional deference expected of flight crew. "I could not help but notice you are having communication difficulties. Sometimes adjusting the antenna orientation can improve signal reception during severe weather conditions." Webb looked up with surprise. "You understand military communication systems?" he asked, his tone suggesting skepticism about a flight attendant's technical knowledge. "Just basic principles," Sarah replied modestly. "I have some background in electronics and communications technology. During severe weather, satellite signals can be disrupted by atmospheric interference, but manual antenna adjustment sometimes helps." Torres overheard the exchange and exchanged a glance with Dalton. "Interesting that a flight attendant would know about military communication protocols," she said quietly. Most civilian crew members would not understand signal propagation theory. Sarah continued her duties, but found herself positioned where she could observe the military officers' attempts to coordinate with ground-based command structures. Their approaches were sound, but lacked the refined techniques that came from extensive field experience in adverse conditions. The aircraft encountered another severe downdraft that caused several passengers to cry out in alarm. The pilots worked to regain altitude and stability, but the strain on both crew and aircraft was becoming evident. Emergency procedures were clearly being considered as options narrowed. Captain Dalton attempted to peer toward the cockpit area to better assess the pilot's stress levels. In military aircraft, we would have multiple redundant communication systems and more aggressive approach capabilities, he said to Torres. Civilian aviation operates with different safety margins. Sarah paused near their conversation while collecting debris that had fallen from overhead compartments during the turbulence. Military aircraft also have different structural tolerances and pilot training requirements, she observed quietly. Commercial aviation prioritizes passenger safety over mission completion. Both pilots looked at her with surprise. That is a rather sophisticated understanding of aviation operational differences, Torres said. Most flight attendants would not be familiar with military versus civilian aircraft capabilities. Sarah smiled politely. I find aviation technology fascinating and read about it during my off time. There are significant differences between military and commercial flight operations. The weather outside continued to intensify, with lightning strikes visible through the cabin windows and rain hammering against the aircraft's exterior. The storm system had grown beyond meteorological predictions, creating challenges that were testing the limits of both crew experience and aircraft capabilities. Colonel Webb made another attempt to establish contact with military command using Sarah's antenna adjustment suggestion. The signal quality improved marginally, allowing brief communication windows between interference bursts. His expression showed grudging acknowledgement of her technical insight. The pilots announced that they were beginning descent toward a military airfield that had better weather conditions than civilian airports in the region. The decision represented a shift toward more aggressive approach procedures that would require precision flying skills under extremely challenging conditions. The decision to divert to Edwards Air Force Base had been made, but the approach would require coordination with military air traffic control and precise navigation through the continuing storm system. The civilian pilots were consulting approach charts while maintaining radio contact with both civilian and military controllers. Sarah positioned herself near the galley, where she could monitor the cockpit communications without appearing to eavesdrop. The radio chatter between the aircraft and Edwards Tower included references to tactical approach procedures and military runway configurations that were outside normal commercial aviation experience. Colonel Webb had managed to establish intermittent contact with his command structure using the communication adjustments Sarah had suggested. His conversations revealed the critical nature of the military personnel aboard and the importance of their timely arrival for Operation Thunder Ridge. The storm system shows no signs of weakening, Major Torres observed to Captain Dalton as they studied weather radar displays on her tablet. Military precision approaches will be required, and these civilian pilots may not have the training for high-performance landing procedures. The head flight attendant made another trip to the cockpit for consultation with the pilots. When she returned, her expression was more serious than before. The pilots are coordinating with Edwards Approach Control, but the weather conditions are still challenging even for a military facility. Sarah continued her crew duties while listening to the military communications frequency that Colonel Webb had tuned to on his secure radio. The tactical coordination being discussed involved multiple aircraft and time-sensitive mission requirements that would be compromised by significant delays. During a brief lull in the turbulence, Captain Dalton approached the cockpit area, attempting to offer assistance to the civilian pilots. His flight experience included military precision approaches, but commercial aviation protocols limited his ability to provide direct input to the flight crew. The aircraft shuddered through another series of downdrafts as it began its descent toward Edwards. The pilots were following military approach controllers' vectors, but their lack of familiarity with tactical landing procedures was becoming apparent through the radio communications Sarah could overhear. Edwards' approach control was providing detailed guidance for the non-standard approach required by the weather conditions. The instructions included references to military navigation aids and approach techniques that were unfamiliar to commercial aviation crews but routine for military pilots. Sarah moved through the cabin securing items for landing while mentally noting the approach vectors being transmitted from Edwards Tower. Her extensive experience with military airfield operations provided context that the civilian crew was lacking for the complex approach requirements. Colonel Webb's communication with command revealed the broader implications of potential delays. Multiple mission-critical personnel were aboard, and their late arrival would cascade through operational timelines already strained by the unexpected weather system affecting the entire region. The radio communications between the aircraft and Edwards approach control became more frequent as the descent continued. The military controllers were accommodating the civilian crew's limitations while maintaining safety standards required for the challenging weather approach. Major Torres and Captain Dalton discussed the approach procedures they could overhear being transmitted to the cockpit. Both recognized that the civilian pilots were receiving guidance for maneuvers that would be routine for military crews, but represented significant challenges for commercial aviation training. Sarah noticed the increasing stress in the civilian crew's voices as they coordinated with military air traffic control. The approach requirements were pushing beyond their normal operational experience, though they maintained professional composure throughout the communications. The weather radar showed the storm system extending across multiple states, confirming that the diversion to Edwards was necessary despite the challenges it presented. Other aircraft were also being diverted to military facilities as civilian airports remained below safe landing minimums. Through the cabin windows, the lights of Edwards Air Force Base became visible through the storm clouds as the aircraft continued its approach. The military installation's precision approach lighting systems provided better guidance than civilian airports could offer under the adverse weather conditions. Colonel Webb monitored both the aircraft's approach progress and his communications with military command. The coordination required for Operation Thunder Ridge was becoming increasingly complex as weather delays affected multiple components of the planned mission timeline. The pilots announced that they were beginning the final approach phase to Edwards Air Force Base. The passengers could feel the aircraft's configuration changes as landing gear and flaps were deployed for the challenging approach through continuing storm conditions. The approach to Edwards Air Force Base was proving more challenging than anticipated as the civilian pilots struggled with military precision approach procedures they had never trained for. The radio communications revealed increasing tension between the aircraft crew and Edwards approach control as safety margins narrowed. Sarah listened from her position near the galley as Edwards Tower transmitted complex approach vectors that required immediate compliance. The civilian pilots were requesting clarification on procedures that were standard for military operations but unfamiliar to commercial aviation crews. Edwards approach, Flight 447. Could you repeat the tactical offset approach instructions? The captain transmitted with obvious stress in his voice. We are not familiar with these non-standard approach procedures. Major Torres and Captain Dalton exchanged concerned looks as they overheard the cockpit communications. These civilian pilots are out of their depth, Torres said quietly to Dalton. Military precision approaches require training and experience they simply do not possess. Colonel Webb moved closer to the cockpit area, his command experience telling him that intervention might soon be necessary. The weather conditions and approach requirements were exceeding the civilian crew's capabilities, creating a potentially dangerous situation for everyone aboard. Flight 447, Edwards approach, you're drifting off course. Recommend immediate correction to heading to Savenzaro and maintain 3,000 feet until further advised. Weather conditions require precise navigation for safe approach. The aircraft lurched as the pilots attempted to comply with the complex approach instructions while fighting turbulence that continued to challenge their control inputs. Sarah could hear the strain in their voices as they coordinated between themselves about procedures they were not trained to execute. Captain Dalton stood up despite the turbulence. "I need to offer assistance to these pilots," he said to Torres. "They are attempting maneuvers that require military flight training. This could become a serious safety issue." Torres nodded in agreement. "The approach vectors Edwards is transmitting are standard for military crews, but completely outside commercial aviation training. These pilots need help from someone familiar with tactical approach procedures." Sarah observed the developing crisis while maintaining her flight attendant duties. Her extensive experience with Edwards approach procedures and military precision flying could resolve the situation, but her cover identity prevented her from offering direct assistance to the flight crew. The head flight attendant emerged from the cockpit, looking visibly shaken. "The pilots are requesting any passengers with military flight experience to provide assistance with the approach procedures. They admit they are unfamiliar with the tactical approach requirements Edwards is requesting." Colonel Webb immediately stepped forward. "I have command experience but limited recent flight time. However, Major Torres and Captain Dalton are current military pilots with precision approach qualifications." Both pilots moved toward the cockpit area to offer their assistance. Their confidence was evident as they prepared to take charge of a situation they believed was within their area of expertise, despite the challenging weather conditions and unfamiliar aircraft systems. "Flight 447, Edwards approach. You are again deviating from assigned heading and altitude. Immediate correction required for safe approach continuation. Weather window is narrowing rapidly." The civilian pilots accepted the offer of assistance from the military passengers, acknowledging that the approach requirements exceeded their training and experience. Major Torres and Captain Dalton prepared to enter the cockpit to provide guidance for the complex military approach procedures. Sarah watched as the military officers took charge of the situation with the confidence typical of their training and experience. Their assumption that they could handle any flight-related challenge was evident in their demeanor as they prepared to assist with the Edwards approach. As Torres and Dalton entered the cockpit area, Sarah could hear their immediate assessment of the approach situation. Their professional confidence was apparent as they began consulting with the civilian pilots about military precision approach techniques and procedures. However, the radio communications from Edwards Approach Control soon revealed that the situation was more complex than the military passengers had initially assessed. The weather conditions and approach requirements were testing even military-trained capabilities under the current circumstances. Edwards Approach, Flight 447. We now have military pilot assistance aboard. Request confirmation of approach parameters and any special procedures required for civilian aircraft on military precision approach. The response from Edwards Tower included technical specifications and approach requirements that challenged even the military pilot's experience. The combination of severe weather, unfamiliar aircraft systems, and time-critical approach windows was creating a situation that would test the limits of conventional military flight training. Sarah remained at her crew station, observing as the situation developed beyond what the military passengers had expected when they volunteered their assistance. The confidence they had displayed when taking charge was being tested by circumstances that exceeded routine military flight operations. Major Torres and Captain Dalton had taken positions in the cockpit to assist the civilian pilots, but the complexity of the Edwards approach was proving more challenging than their standard military flight training had prepared them for. The weather conditions and aircraft systems were creating complications they had not anticipated. Edwards approach, Flight 447. We need you to execute a modified tactical approach due to deteriorating weather conditions. Stand by for specialized approach vectors that will require precise timing and coordination. From her position in the cabin, Sarah could hear the confusion in the cockpit as even the military pilots struggled with the non-standard approach procedures Edwards was requesting. The tactical approach requirements were beyond routine military training and into specialized operational territory. Captain Dalton's voice carried obvious strain as he attempted to coordinate with Edwards Approach Control. Edwards Approach, Flight 447. Could you clarify the offset angle requirements for this modified approach? We're not familiar with these specific tactical vectors. The situation was deteriorating as the aircraft continued to fight severe turbulence, while attempting to follow approach instructions that were challenging even the military-trained pilots. Sarah recognized the approach procedures being transmitted as one she had trained extensively on during her elite pilot certification. Colonel Webb monitored the communications from the cabin, his expression growing more concerned as he realized that even his experienced military pilots were struggling with the Edwards approach requirements. The confidence they had displayed when volunteering their assistance was being tested by circumstances beyond their training. Sarah moved through the cabin, maintaining her flight attendant duties while listening to the increasingly urgent radio communications. The approach vectors being transmitted required knowledge of specialized tactical flying techniques that went beyond standard military pilot training. Flight 447, Edwards Approach. You are approaching minimum weather conditions for this approach. Precision execution will be required with no margin for deviation from assigned vectors and altitudes. Major Torres emerged briefly from the cockpit to consult with Colonel Webb. The approach requirements are more complex than standard military procedures, she admitted quietly. We are dealing with specialized tactical approach techniques that require advanced training we do not possess. The acknowledgement that the military pilots were reaching the limits of their capabilities created a new level of concern among the passengers. The assumption that military training would be sufficient for any flight-related challenge was being proven incorrect by the current circumstances. Sarah observed the developing crisis while maintaining her professional composure. Her extensive experience with exactly these types of specialized tactical approaches could resolve the situation, but revealing her capabilities would compromise the cover identity she had maintained throughout her career. Edwards Approach Control transmitted another series of complex approach vectors that included references to specialized navigation techniques and precision timing requirements. The instructions were becoming increasingly specific and demanding as weather conditions continued to deteriorate around the airfield. Captain Dalton returned to the cabin, looking visibly shaken. The approach procedures Edwards is requiring are beyond our training level, he said to Colonel Webb. We need someone with specialized tactical approach experience that goes beyond standard military pilot qualifications. The civilian pilots were maintaining control of the aircraft, but clearly struggling with the guidance they were receiving from the military passengers. The combination of unfamiliar procedures and deteriorating weather was creating a dangerous situation that was testing everyone's capabilities. Sarah continued her duties while monitoring the radio communications that revealed the full complexity of the situation. The approach requirements being transmitted from Edwards included elements of specialized tactical flying that she had mastered during her elite pilot training program. Colonel Webb began to realize that the situation required capabilities beyond what any of the military passengers possessed. His command experience told him that immediate action would be needed, but the available options were becoming increasingly limited as weather conditions narrowed the approach window. Flight 447, Edwards Approach, Final Approach Clearance. You are cleared for Modified Tactical Approach Runway 22. Weather conditions are at minimums. Precise execution required for safe landing. The final approach clearance meant that the aircraft would have one opportunity to execute the complex tactical approach procedure successfully. The margin for error was eliminated by the weather conditions, and the approach would require the highest level of precision flying skills available. Sarah realized that the situation had reached the point where her intervention would be necessary to ensure the safety of everyone aboard. The specialized tactical approach procedures required capabilities that exceeded the training of the military pilots who had volunteered their assistance to the civilian crew. The situation in the cockpit had reached a critical point as both civilian and military pilots struggled with the specialized tactical approach procedures that Edwards Air Force Base was requiring. The weather window was closing rapidly, and the margin for error had been eliminated by the deteriorating conditions. Flight 447, Edwards approach. You have one approach opportunity remaining. Weather conditions are at absolute minimums. Any deviation from assigned vectors will require immediate abort and diversion to alternate field 200 miles south. The announcement of a single approach opportunity sent a wave of tension through the aircraft. Colonel Webb moved closer to the cockpit area, where he could monitor the increasingly desperate attempts to coordinate the complex approach procedures that were beyond the capabilities of anyone currently at the controls. Major Torres emerged from the cockpit looking defeated. The tactical approach vectors require specialized training that none of us possess, she announced to the military passengers. We are dealing with procedures that go beyond standard military flight training into elite pilot territory. Captain Dalton followed her out, his earlier confidence completely shaken. The precision, timing, and navigation requirements are unlike anything in our experience. These are advanced tactical procedures that require years of specialized training to execute safely. Sarah listened to the developing crisis while maintaining her flight attendant duties. The approach procedures being transmitted from Edwards were ones she had not only trained on extensively, but had executed successfully under even more challenging conditions during her combat deployments. The civilian pilots were maintaining radio contact with Edwards approach control, but their stress was evident in every transmission. They had acknowledged that the approach was beyond their capabilities and were requesting any available assistance from passengers with advanced flight training. Edwards approach, Flight 447. Do you have any passengers aboard with specialized tactical flight experience? Current weather conditions require elite pilot capabilities for safe approach execution. Colonel Webb looked around the cabin desperately. Is there anyone aboard with advanced tactical flight training? He called out to the passengers. We need someone with specialized approach experience that goes beyond standard military qualifications. The military passengers exchanged glances, each acknowledging that their combined experience was insufficient for the current requirements. The confidence they had displayed earlier when taking charge of the situation had been replaced by the sobering reality of their limitations. Sarah observed the scene while continuing her professional duties. The moment was approaching when she would need to reveal her true capabilities to save the aircraft and everyone aboard. Her cover identity had been maintained for years, but the current crisis left no alternative. Flight 447, Edwards approach. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. You have less than 10 minutes before conditions fall below approach minimums. Immediate decision required for approach execution or diversion to alternate field. The time pressure was mounting as Edwards approach control made clear that the window for landing was closing rapidly. The alternate field was hundreds of miles away with no guarantee of better weather conditions, and fuel considerations were becoming a factor in the decision process. Major Torres looked at Captain Dalton with obvious frustration. We are trained military pilots, but these procedures require capabilities that are beyond our qualifications. Someone with elite tactical flight experience is needed immediately. The head flight attendant made another consultation trip to the cockpit before returning with an increasingly desperate expression. The pilots are requesting immediate assistance from anyone with advanced tactical approach training. They cannot execute the required procedure safely. Colonel Webb stood up and addressed the entire first-class cabin. This is a critical situation requiring specialized flight capabilities. If anyone aboard has advanced tactical pilot training, your assistance is urgently needed to ensure everyone's safety. Sarah felt the weight of the moment as she realized that her intervention was no longer optional. The safety of everyone aboard depended on capabilities that only she possessed among the passengers and crew. Her years of cover identity were about to be sacrificed for the lives of those around her. The radio communications from Edwards became more urgent as weather conditions continued to deteriorate around the airfield. The approach window was measured in minutes, and the decision point for revealing her true identity had arrived. Edwards approach, Flight 447. Final weather update shows conditions at absolute minimums. Approach must be executed immediately or diversion will be mandatory. Do you have qualified personnel available for tactical approach execution? The question from Edwards' approach control hung in the air as everyone aboard realized that conventional solutions had been exhausted. The situation required capabilities that exceeded all normal training and experience levels available through standard military or civilian aviation channels. Sarah stepped forward from her crew station, her professional flight attendant demeanor shifting as she moved toward the cockpit area where the crisis was unfolding. Colonel Webb looked at her with confusion as she approached the group of military officers who had been desperately seeking someone with elite tactical flight capabilities. "I have the specialized training you need," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a new authority that made everyone stop and stare at her. "I can execute the tactical approach procedures Edwards is requiring." Major Torres looked at her incredulously. "You're a flight attendant. These procedures require years of advanced military pilot training. This is not something you learn from reading aviation magazines." Sarah moved past the skeptical officers toward the cockpit entrance. "I have over 3,000 hours in tactical approach procedures under adverse conditions. My qualifications exceed what this situation requires." Captain Dalton stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "This is ridiculous. A civilian flight attendant cannot possibly have the training needed for military precision approaches. You could get everyone killed with false confidence." Edwards' approach, Flight 447, weather conditions are now at absolute minimums. Immediate approach execution required or mandatory diversion. Confirm availability of qualified tactical pilot. Sarah looked directly at Colonel Webb. "Sir, with respect, we have less than 5 minutes before this window closes completely. I need to communicate directly with Edwards Approach Control to coordinate the specialized approach procedures." Webb studied her face, noting the transformation from subservient flight attendant to someone displaying obvious command presence. Something in her bearing suggested capabilities that contradicted her apparent civilian status, but the stakes were too high for hesitation. The civilian pilots emerged from the cockpit looking desperate. "We need immediate assistance from someone qualified for tactical approaches. The weather conditions are beyond our capabilities and training." Sarah moved toward the cockpit radio. "Edwards approach, Flight 447. This is Phantom 7 requesting direct coordination for tactical approach execution. I am assuming approach coordination responsibilities." The radio fell silent for several seconds before Edwards Approach Control responded. "Phantom 7. Edwards Approach, confirm your identity and qualifications for tactical approach procedures." Sarah keyed the microphone with practiced precision. "Edwards Approach. Phantom 7 is qualified for all-weather tactical approaches with current certification in adverse condition procedures. Ready to execute modified tactical approach on your vectors." Major Torres grabbed Sarah's arm in disbelief. "Phantom 7? That call sign is reserved for elite tactical pilots. There is no way a flight attendant has access to those identification codes." "Edwards Approach, Phantom 7. Roger your qualifications. We have your certification on file. You are cleared to coordinate tactical approach execution. Stand by for specialized approach vectors." Captain Dalton stared at Sarah in shock. "How does Edwards have your certification on file? Elite pilot call signs are restricted to military personnel with the highest security clearances." Sarah began coordinating with Edwards Approach Control using terminology and procedures that demonstrated extensive experience with specialized tactical operations. Her communications were precise and confident, revealing knowledge that went far beyond anything a civilian flight attendant should possess. Colonel Webb watched the transformation with growing realization. The professional competence she displayed while coordinating the approach procedures indicated training and experience that contradicted everything they had assumed about her background and capabilities. Edwards Approach, Phantom 7, beginning modified tactical approach sequence. Confirm approach lighting configuration and precision guidance availability for adverse weather execution. The radio communications between Sarah and Edwards Approach Control continued with technical specificity that amazed the military officers listening. Her knowledge of tactical approach procedures was not only accurate, but demonstrated familiarity with the most advanced techniques available. Major Torres stood back as Sarah took complete control of the approach coordination. The confidence and expertise she displayed while communicating with Edwards' approach control proved that her qualifications were genuine and extensive. Edwards' approach, Phantom 7, Roger approach clearance. Beginning tactical descent profile with precision navigation for runway 22. Weather conditions acknowledged and compensated for in approach execution. Sarah's coordination with Edwards' approach control proceeded flawlessly as she demonstrated mastery of the specialized procedures that had defeated both civilian and military pilots. Her tactical approach knowledge was comprehensive and current. The aircraft responded to her coordinated instructions as Edwards' approach control provided the specialized guidance needed for safe landing under the adverse weather conditions. Her expertise was transforming a desperate situation into a controlled tactical approach execution. Sarah executed the tactical approach with precision that left the military officers speechless as they watched her coordinate maneuvers they had never seen performed under such challenging conditions. Her communication with Edwards' approach control was flawless as she guided the aircraft through the complex vectors required for safe landing. Edwards' approach, Phantom 7, final approach segment initiated. Precision guidance locked, weather compensation active. Landing assured on runway 22. Major Torres stepped back from the cockpit entrance, her face showing complete shock as she watched Sarah execute procedures that had been beyond the capabilities of trained military pilots. "That is impossible," she whispered to Captain Dalton. "She is performing tactical maneuvers that require years of specialized training." The aircraft touched down smoothly on Edwards' runway despite weather conditions that would have defeated conventional approach attempts. Sarah's coordination had transformed a potentially catastrophic situation into a textbook tactical landing execution. Edwards' approach, Phantom 7, touchdown confirmed runway 22. Taxi instructions requested for military ramp area. Colonel Webb stared at Sarah as she continued coordinating with Edwards' ground control for taxi instructions to the military ramp. The professional competence she displayed contradicted everything he had assumed about her background during the entire flight. Captain Dalton looked stunned as he processed what he had just witnessed. She executed a tactical approach that neither of us could handle. Her capabilities are beyond anything in standard military pilot training. Sarah completed the post-landing coordination with Edwards' ground control before turning to address the military officers who were staring at her in disbelief. "The tactical approach procedures required for this landing are part of my regular qualification requirements." Major Torres found her voice first. Phantom 7 is a call sign reserved for elite tactical pilots with the highest security clearances. How does a flight attendant have access to those qualifications and certifications? The civilian pilots emerged from the cockpit looking grateful but confused. "We have never seen tactical approach procedures executed with that level of precision. Your coordination saved everyone aboard this aircraft." Sarah began returning to her flight attendant duties as if the extraordinary demonstration of pilot capabilities had been routine. "I am glad we could ensure everyone's safety during the emergency landing situation." Colonel Webb stepped forward, his expression showing a mixture of respect and bewilderment. "Those are not basic pilot skills. You demonstrated elite tactical capabilities that are restricted to the most advanced military flight programs." Edwards' ground control, Phantom 7, taxi complete to military ramp. Request security coordination for passenger processing through military facility. The radio communication reminded everyone that they were now at a military installation rather than their original civilian destination. Sarah's tactical approach had not only saved their lives, but had brought them to a facility that required different security procedures. Captain Dalton approached Sarah with obvious respect, replacing his earlier dismissive attitude. "I owe you an apology. Your flight capabilities are beyond anything I have encountered in standard military aviation." Major Torres nodded in agreement. We assumed civilian crew members could not possess advanced tactical training. Your demonstration proved how wrong our assumptions were about your qualifications. The head flight attendant looked at Sarah with new understanding. Your background is obviously more complex than your current position would suggest. Thank you for saving everyone aboard. Sarah smiled politely while continuing to secure the cabin for arrival processing. My priority was ensuring passenger safety during the emergency situation. The tactical approach procedures were necessary under the circumstances. Edwards' ground personnel began coordinating passenger processing through the military facility. The unexpected arrival required security procedures that were different from civilian airport processing, but Sarah seemed familiar with military-based protocols. Colonel Webb observed Sarah's familiarity with military facility procedures. Your knowledge extends beyond flight operations into military-based security protocols. This suggests extensive experience with military installations. The passengers began gathering their belongings while processing the extraordinary events they had just witnessed. The transformation of their flight attendant into an elite tactical pilot had saved their lives under circumstances that had defeated trained military personnel. Sarah assisted passengers with deplaning procedures while maintaining her professional flight attendant demeanor. The demonstration of her elite pilot capabilities had been necessary for safety, but she appeared ready to return to her cover identity. Major Torres and Captain Dalton exchanged glances as they prepared to deplane. Both realized that their earlier dismissive comments about civilian aviation capabilities had been proven completely wrong by someone whose true qualifications exceeded their own training. As passengers deplaned at Edwards Air Force Base, the atmosphere had transformed completely from the dismissive attitudes displayed during the original flight. Colonel Webb approached Sarah at the aircraft door, where she maintained her professional flight attendant duties despite having just saved everyone aboard. "Miss Chun," Webb said with genuine respect, "I need to apologize for my earlier behavior. Your capabilities far exceed anything we assumed possible from civilian crew members. Your tactical pilot skills saved our lives." Sarah smiled politely while assisting other passengers with their belongings. "Thank you, Colonel. I was simply doing what was necessary to ensure everyone's safety during the emergency situation." Major Torres waited nearby with Captain Dalton, both looking humbled by the events they had witnessed. "The tactical approach procedures you executed were beyond our training level. We owe you our gratitude and our respect." The businessman from row 12 who had asked about her aviation experience approached with obvious amazement. "When I asked about military flights, I never imagined you had the qualifications to actually pilot them. Your background is extraordinary." Sarah continued her professional duties while acknowledging the transformed attitudes around her. "Aviation has always been my passion, and I have been fortunate to receive extensive training in various flight operations." Colonel Webb studied her with new understanding. "Phantom 7 is not a call sign assigned to ordinary pilots. Your qualifications suggest involvement in operations that require the highest security clearances and tactical capabilities." The civilian pilots approached to express their gratitude before departing for crew rest facilities. Captain Williams extended his hand to Sarah. "Your intervention saved our aircraft and everyone aboard. We have never witnessed tactical flying skills of that caliber." First Officer Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "The precision approach procedures you coordinated were beyond anything in our training or experience. Thank you for taking charge when we needed expert assistance." Sarah shook their hands with professional courtesy. Commercial and military aviation required different skill sets. I was glad my background could contribute when specialized procedures were necessary. Edwards-based security personnel arrived to coordinate passenger processing through the military facility. Their interaction with Sarah suggested familiarity with her credentials and clearance levels that reinforced the mystery surrounding her true identity and assignments. Captain Dalton approached with obvious respect, replacing his earlier condescension. "I made assumptions about civilian capabilities that were completely wrong. Your demonstration of elite pilot skills has been a learning experience for all of us." The passenger from seat 14C, who had initially demanded coffee service, now looked embarrassed about his earlier dismissive attitude. I had no idea about your qualifications when I was asking for beverage service. Your background is obviously much more significant than apparent. Sarah maintained her gracious demeanor while completing her crew duties. Everyone has different backgrounds and experiences. I hope your mission coordination proceeds smoothly despite the weather delays we encountered. Colonel Webb coordinated with Edwards' personnel about transportation to their original destination for Operation Thunder Ridge. The delays caused by weather would require adjustment of mission timelines, but everyone was grateful to have arrived safely. Major Torres and Captain Dalton gathered their equipment while discussing the tactical approach procedures they had witnessed. Both acknowledged that their understanding of aviation capabilities had been fundamentally changed by Sarah's demonstration of elite pilot skills. As passengers departed toward base transportation, many stopped to thank Sarah for her life-saving intervention during the emergency landing. The transformation from dismissive attitudes to genuine respect was complete among everyone who had witnessed her capabilities. Edwards Base Operations coordinated alternative transportation to the original destination for the military personnel. Colonel Webb ensured that Sarah received appropriate recognition for her critical role in ensuring everyone's safety during the emergency situation. The head flight attendant coordinated with airline operations about crew rest and alternative transportation arrangements. Sarah's dual role as flight attendant and elite tactical pilot would require careful handling by airline management and military liaison personnel. Before you go, think about this story and the assumptions we make about people based on their apparent roles. Have you ever discovered that someone in your life had hidden talents or backgrounds that completely changed your perspective about their capabilities? Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, serving others while possessing skills that could change everything when the moment demands it.